Ethan Cross arrived in Pine Hollow with nothing but a shadowed past, and Officer Daniel Hart was the steady protector whose quiet vigilance would soon collide with Ethan's darkest plan, setting off a night of betrayal, pursuit, and a chilling test of survival. Pine Hollow was the kind of place where people waved to each other on the street even if they didn't know one another's names. It was a town of weathered porches, quiet sidewalks, and a single main road lined with family-owned shops that closed early every night. Locals liked to brag that nothing bad ever happened there, at least nothing worth putting in the newspaper. On summer evenings, children rode their bikes until the sun dipped below the pine trees and the smell of backyard barbecues drifted through the air. Outsiders rarely stayed long, and when they did, they were usually passing through on their way to somewhere bigger. That was exactly why Ethan Cross chose it. He wanted a place where no one would notice a stranger who kept to himself. Ethan arrived in late autumn, when the crisp air carried the scent of wet leaves and wood smoke. He rented a small room above a closed-down bakery, paying cash to avoid questions. To the few who met him, he seemed like any other drifter looking for seasonal work. He offered a polite nod when greeted, but never lingered long enough for conversation. People in Pine Hollow were used to minding their own business, and Ethan made it easy for them. Behind his quiet face, however, his thoughts were anything but calm. Years of small crimes, run-ins with the law, and nights spent in county jails had hardened him. He carried a grudge against authority that burned like a slow fire. Every time he saw a badge, he felt the weight of every arrest and every night behind bars pressing on his chest. During the day, Ethan wandered the back roads and forest trails that surrounded the town. He liked the way the pine trees muffled sound and the way the fog rolled in over the hills at dusk. Out there, away from watchful eyes, he felt in control. He told himself he wasn't like the officers who had humiliated him in the past. They were a part of a system that cared more about rules than people, and he convinced himself that someone needed to teach them a lesson. The thought started as a faint idea, nothing more than a bitter whisper, but each lonely walk fed it until it became something heavier. The quiet of Pine Hollow gave him space to nurture that anger, and the town's easygoing nature made it feel safe to hide in plain sight. Ethan studied the rhythms of the town with the patience of someone who had nowhere else to be. He noticed when the street lights flickered on each evening and when the grocery clerk locked the front door. He paid attention to the police patrols, counting how many times a cruiser passed through Main Street at night. The locals saw nothing unusual about a newcomer sitting on a park bench after dark, but Ethan's eyes were always tracking the same thing, the steady presence of law enforcement. Each sighting fed the dark plan forming in his mind. Pine Hollow seemed perfect for someone who wanted to stay invisible, but Ethan wasn't content to remain unseen forever. Officer Daniel Hart had served in Pine Hollow for over a decade, and in that time he had become more than just the man in uniform. He was the one who returned lost dogs to their owners, the first to show up when a neighbor's car battery died, and the patient listener when a lonely resident needed someone to talk to. His presence brought comfort to the town, a steady reminder that someone was always watching out for them. Hart knew every pothole in the roads and every shortcut through the woods, and he greeted most people by name. In a place where life moved slowly, he was a constant figure of quiet authority, respected and liked in equal measure. Ethan noticed Hart almost immediately. On his first night in town, he saw the patrol car glide down Main Street at precisely 9 o'clock, headlights cutting through the mist. Hart's route was predictable but not careless, a careful pattern meant to keep the town safe. Ethan watched from the shadows as the officer paused near the old bakery where Ethan rented his room, the car idling for a few moments before moving on. Something about the calm way Hart scanned the street struck Ethan as infuriating. The officer didn't know him, yet he seemed to carry the same silent judgment Ethan had faced in every other town. To Ethan, Hart wasn't a friendly guardian. He was another badge, another reminder of the authority Ethan despised. Over the following weeks, Ethan made a habit of tracking Hart's movements. He learned the timing of the nightly patrols, the way the officers slowed near the park after closing hours, and the back roads he favored when cutting across town. Hart's attention to detail frustrated Ethan. The officer never left his car unlocked, never lingered in one place too long, and always seemed to notice when something was out of place. Ethan began to study these habits with the same intensity a hunter gives his prey, memorizing each pause and turn. The more he observed, the more his resentment grew. Hart's easy smile and friendly interactions with locals only deepened Ethan's sense of alienation. He convinced himself that the officer's kindness was an act, a mask for control. While most of Pine Hollow welcomed Hart's steady presence, Ethan saw an opportunity in it. He knew the officer's reliability could be used against him. A man who always answered calls and followed routine could be lured into a trap if the bait was convincing enough. Ethan spent long nights in his rented room, replaying Hart's patrol patterns in his mind and sketching crude maps of the town. He imagined different scenarios, testing each one against Hart's cautious nature. Each failed idea only sharpened Ethan's focus. He told himself this wasn't just revenge. It was a way to prove he was smarter than the system that had caged him so many times before. Ethan's fixation became an obsession, a dangerous mix of planning and paranoia. He believed Hart represented every officer who had ever stood between him and freedom. To strike at this single man, Ethan thought, would be to strike at all of them? The quiet streets of Pine Hollow, once a backdrop for peaceful nights, now felt like the setting for a game only he understood. And in Ethan's mind, he was determined to win. The night Ethan chose for his plan came after weeks of careful preparation. Pine Hollow was wrapped in a damp chill, the kind of evening when fog drifted low over the ground and the pine trees whispered in the wind. Rain had fallen earlier, leaving the streets slick and gleaming under the dim glow of the streetlights. Ethan saw opportunity in the weather. Fewer people would be out, and the wet roads would cover his footprints and dull the sound of his movements. From his small room above the bakery, he checked the clock again and again, each passing minute tightening the knot in his stomach. He had rehearsed every detail, but the waiting made his thoughts feel heavy and electric all at once. He had spent days scouting the abandoned lumber mill on the edge of town, a forgotten building surrounded by woods and a cracked gravel road. The place smelled of rust and damp earth, and the sagging roof kept it hidden from the main road. It was perfect for what he wanted, dark, isolated, and easy to reach without drawing attention. Using a prepaid phone, he placed a false emergency call to the police station, claiming he'd seen suspicious activity near the mill. His voice was steady as he gave the details, masking the surge of adrenaline beneath his calm tone. Hanging up, he felt a brief thrill, a sense that he was finally controlling the game. Ethan positioned himself behind a cluster of fallen logs near the building, where the shadows were deepest. He crouched low, his eyes fixed on the road that wound through the trees. The silence of the forest pressed in around him, broken only by the occasional drip of water from the branches. Time stretched painfully as he waited for the sound of approaching tires. Every creak of wood and distant rustle of leaves set his nerves on edge. He tightened his grip on the piece of metal pipe he had brought, a crude weapon hidden beneath his jacket. In his mind, he pictured Officer Hart stepping out of his patrol car, unaware of the danger. The image fueled his determination, though a faint flicker of doubt worked its way through the edges of his thoughts. When headlights finally appeared through the fog, Ethan's pulse quickened. The patrol car slowed as it approached the mill, its beams cutting across the wet ground and glinting off the broken windows. Hart stepped out with the quiet confidence of someone who had done this countless times before. He scanned the area, his flashlight sweeping in slow, deliberate arcs. Ethan froze, realizing how still and watchful the officer remained. Hart moved with a caution that suggested he sensed something out of place. He paused near the edge of the clearing, lifting his radio to speak in a low voice. Unbeknownst to Ethan, Hart was already calling for backup, reporting the suspicious scene without breaking his measured stride. Ethan's plan depended on surprise, but the forest betrayed him. As he shifted his weight to get a better view, a branch snapped sharply beneath his foot. The sound was small but unmistakable in the heavy silence. Hart's flashlight swung instantly toward the noise, the beam landing dangerously close to Ethan's hiding spot. Panic surged through Ethan as he realized the perfect trap he had imagined was unraveling before his eyes. Ethan bolted the instant the flashlight beam sliced through the darkness. His heart pounded as he lunged deeper into the woods, mud splashing under his boots and wet branches whipping against his face. The cold night air burned his lungs, but the sound of pursuit was even sharper. Behind him came the steady crunch of Officer Hart's steps, quick but controlled, a rhythm that cut through the rustling forest. Every stride reminded Ethan that this wasn't the desperate sprint of an untrained civilian, it was the practiced chase of someone who knew exactly how to follow without losing ground. The wet leaves that had seemed like a helpful cover now worked against him, making each step slippery and loud. The forest was a maze of shadow and fog. Tree trunks loomed like dark pillars, their outlines blurred by the mist. Ethan zigzagged between them, hoping to break Hart's line of sight, but the officer never faltered. Hart called for additional units through his radio as he ran, his voice steady despite the chase. Somewhere in the distance, the faint hum of engines answered. The sound of backup arriving tightened the panic in Ethan's chest. He had counted on isolation, but now the quiet woods were filling with a slow, invisible net of law enforcement. Every breath of fog seemed to carry the echo of approaching help. Ethan tried to think of an escape route, but the forest paths he had scouted during the day looked different in the dark. Landmarks vanished behind the curtain of mist, and the drizzle blurred the edges of every trail. His shoes slipped on slick roots, and the cold mud clung to his clothes like a warning that the earth itself wanted to hold him back. He turned sharply toward a narrow ravine, hoping the steep drop would slow the officer. The ground crumbled beneath his feet as he slid down the slope, scraping his hands on wet rock. For a brief moment, he thought he'd gained distance. Then the beam of Hart's flashlight cut through the fog again, closer than before. The sound of engines grew louder, mixed with the faint whir of something mechanical above the trees. A pale light swept across the forest canopy, and Ethan looked up to see a drone hovering silently overhead. Panic surged through him as he realized his hiding places were shrinking. The technology he hadn't accounted for was now marking his position in the dark. He stumbled forward, trying to outrun the circle of light that followed him, but every movement only made him easier to track. The forest no longer felt like a shield, it felt like a trap that tightened with every step. Hart moved carefully, never rushing, letting the coordination of backup officers close the distance. The flashing lights of patrol cars began to flicker faintly through the trees, their reflections dancing against the wet ground. Ethan's frantic escape turned into a stumbling retreat, his legs heavy and his breath ragged. The chase that had started as a test of his cleverness was becoming a slow surrender. The town he had believed would keep him hidden had turned into a stage where every misstep was illuminated and every second brought the walls of law and training closer around him. Ethan's final sprint ended in a tangle of mud and roots at the base of a shallow creek. His legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed onto the wet ground, gasping for air that refused to fill his burning lungs. The distant hum of engines had grown into the unmistakable roar of approaching patrol cars. Red and blue flashes flickered against the trees, painting the fog with restless color. He could hear Hart's footsteps drawing closer, steady and unrelenting, like the ticking of a clock running out of time. The adrenaline that had fueled his escape drained away, leaving only the heavy weight of exhaustion and the sharp edge of panic. Every plan he had built so carefully was dissolving, replaced by the cold realization that he had nowhere left to go. Officer Hart emerged from the trees with the calm focus of a man trained to end dangerous nights without bloodshed. He didn't shout or charge. Instead, he kept a measured distance, his flashlight held steady while his free hand signaled to the officers closing in from the other side of the creek. The coordination was silent but precise, a choreography of experience that left Ethan boxed in before he fully understood what was happening. The beam of the flashlight fixed on him like a spotlight, exposing the mud-streaked face of a man who had believed he could outsmart the law. Hart's voice, low and firm, carried across the creek, each word deliberate and controlled. The sound wasn't a threat, it was the assurance of someone who intended to end the night alive. Ethan felt the cold water seep through his clothes as he knelt in the shallow creek, the metal pipe still hidden beneath his jacket but now useless. His mind raced through options: fight, flee, bargain, but every thought collapsed under the weight of reality. The forest was alive with movement as more officers closed the circle. A drone hovered above, its faint buzz mixing with the distant murmur of radios. The town he had chosen for its silence now echoed with the quiet efficiency of a force he could not overcome. For a brief second, the defiance that had driven him flickered like a dying flame, and he finally raised his empty hands. Two officers waded into the creek, their movements careful but confident. They secured Ethan with practiced speed, the cold bite of the handcuffs snapping shut against his wrists. Hart remained close, his watchful eyes never leaving the man who had spent weeks plotting his death. There was no anger in the officer's expression, only the steady awareness of someone who understood the danger had passed. As they led Ethan up the muddy bank toward the flashing lights, the drone overhead drifted away, its job complete. The trial that followed left little room for doubt. Investigators uncovered Ethan's maps, his notes on patrol patterns, and the phone used to place the false emergency call. Witnesses described his restless behavior and late-night wanderings. The jury took only a few hours to return a verdict of guilty on multiple charges, including attempted murder of a law enforcement officer. Ethan received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The courtroom's quiet after the verdict felt heavier than the forest on that foggy night. Pine Hollow returned to its calm routines, but the story lingered as a warning. The man who thought he could control the game had instead revealed the strength of preparation, training, and the silent unity of a town and willing to be broken.